Welcome, everyone, to the AtA radio show. Today's guest is the Rowdy podcast. He's a First Amendment auditor that came on the scene not that long ago, relatively new. And he's had quite a few interesting audits that, and his own style of auditing that he's developed outside of what a lot of people do. And I just think it would be interesting to have a conversation with him, particularly because of his auditing style. And he's a friend of mine. And I kind of wanted to give you all an opportunity just to get to know about, our relationship and me as just a person and not so much a YouTube creator, so to speak. And John, if you want to just give an introduction for yourself and talk about anything that I didn't.
Sure. My name, I go by Rowdy Podcast. My first name's obviously John, but I go by Rowdy Podcast on YouTube. And I've been doing audits for about 5 months now, just right before the George Floyd thing, but right after COVID had started is when I started, just to give you like a reference of time. And so that's how I got started. And I got started because, I was concerned, just looking at the kind of political landscape and things that are going on, not to get into politics, but just to kind of see what's happening. I was worried that everyone was overlooking something really important, which is just, having our eyes on, constitutional infringements, basic issues and concerns that maybe are out there. And so, that's kind of what made me get started, seeing COVID come down and kind of losing some of those rights that I think the government may be overstepping on, and not even in one particular party. It's just, I think we have to hold our government accountable. So many people won't identify by politics. I want to identify by the Constitution and by just being an American, and watching out for my brothers and sisters.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of auditors start by having these, philosophical ideas about our country. And a lot of what auditing is rooted in a way, politics, but more so in constitutionalism. And I think that a lot of
Yeah.
people sort of get into the auditing scene and then they kind of drift away from those core principles of why they started. And then it becomes, an industry for them.
Yep.
But you have a different way of auditing that most people don't have, and I feel like it's a lot more sincere than a lot of other people. Whereas you go the extra mile to ensure that some kind of change comes about what you do.
Mhm.
And so I'm just curious about how did you develop that auditing style, and why do you do that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And also, I mean, I heard you and Lackluster a couple weeks back talking about that, and I really appreciate you guys, kind of noticing that. And I think the big reason why I want to do follow-ups and I want to show, what the process looks like. How do you make change? I mean, I'm just a regular individual. I decided that I wanted to do something, and so I thought there's got to be a way where I can sit down with leadership and actually have a conversation about what needs to change. And though I don't always get, a response that maybe, the listener or viewer wants to hear or see, or maybe they feel like it's lip service, but at least they can see. The one big thing they can see about that is that I was able to get in and have a conversation. And it's not because I have a YouTube channel. It's not because, I'm somebody special. I'm just a guy with a camera. Anyone listening or watching can do the same thing. But I wanted to show them how, right? Like, it's a lot of times it comes into this gotcha moment feeling, which I understand that. I mean, like you said, it does kind of become an industry, and it does become about money in a certain aspect, because at some point you have to choose, what are you going to do? Are you going to do this full time and put in, the amount of work it takes to create good content that people will watch and be able to follow the storyline, make sure that it's edited properly, looks right, all those things. So you have to make this choice. And so I understand it does sometimes become about money, but Um, to me, the main focus is, the change. So I kind of over time have thought about how do I, and I know you and I have had even conversations about this, but how do I make sure that I'm not just out there for the gotcha moments and I'm actually making true change? Because I know it's possible. And so that's kind of where I developed a style and the follow-ups and kind of having the conversations and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think that it's something that when I first saw your videos, I believe the first one that I even watched was the one that you followed up with, that you included that interview with the, I believe it was a lieutenant.
Yep, Eden
Um,
Prairie Police Department. Yep.
yeah, that was the first one I saw, and most people don't know this, but I actually struggled to make contact with you after that. I
Hmm.
was trying to find your email, and you actually hit me up while I
Yep.
was in the process of trying to hit you up, and it was just very coincidental that we actually made contact with each other.
Yeah.
And then we sort of moved on from there and got to talking, and that developed into more of a friendship nowadays. And as you mentioned in um, the podcast you did with ASD, I called and basically told you, this is the kind of grade that I'm thinking, or this is what I think you might have done right or wrong, and
Hmm.
just kind of went over it with you. But I would just want to make very clear for people that the grades that I assign you were not a reflection of our friendship, right? And I wanted to let people know that even if I have a relationship with an auditor or anyone out there, that doesn't affect how I grade things, or my opinion on their conduct, or none of that. And I just want them to know that, and you to, so maybe you can elaborate on that and tell about your perspective on how that came to be.
Oops. Yeah. So sometimes I'll hit my mic, so sorry about that. I don't know if you can hear that or not, but so so a big part too. I mean, so I started watching your program, and if you guys listen to the ASD Docs podcast that we did, um, you know, it's interesting because I started watching Audit the Audit before I got into auditing. Probably towards the time that you were newer. About a year and some change ago is when I first started to see your episodes and your podcasts. And I thought it was a really interesting concept, and one that I liked because it kind of automatically puts some research towards what auditors are doing to verify. Because one of the most dangerous things is to think that you understand something and you go out there and you're playing for keeps. I mean, this is all real at that point. I mean, you are theoretically risking your life when you're doing auditing. So I've always taken it that seriously, and I like your program for that fact that you are continuously fact checking everyone, not just auditors and not just cops, but the whole entire scenario. I think that's super helpful. And so when I reached out to you, my goal is actually to have you on the podcast. And then you had mentioned that you were actually trying to reach out to me because you wanted to do the Eden Prairie Police Department, video. And so, it was interesting because the first thing you said was roughly like, hey, I just wanted to tell you kind of what I found, some things I want to talk to you about, just that may be able to help you in the future, and then go from there. And so, obviously you said, here's the things that I would want to let you know. Here's some stuff where, case law that I found doesn't necessarily back up what you're saying. And obviously, you were still kind of teetering on the edge there. Is kind of what you told me, and so we discussed, um, what your findings were, and then you told me what my grade was, but it wasn't like it's not like you said, "Hey, I'm thinking about giving you this." It was like, "Here's what I'm giving you, and here's why, and I just want you to be aware of them." And that was it. It wasn't like you gave me legal advice either, but it was just kind of like, here's the research that I found. Take it or leave it, but just be aware of that. So I really like that. And then I think you did another episode with St. Louis Park Police Department, if I'm correct, and it was kind of a similar thing. And you said, I don't know if are you, do you want to see it beforehand or not? Not to make any changes, but like a day before, I think you said you would let me do. And I said, no, I didn't know you were doing it in the first place. I mean, you're very quiet about what you're doing, the stories that you're doing. And I kind of like that because then our friendship's just organic. And I don't think it's good to cross the two, even though it's how we met. Hopefully that makes sense. But
Yeah.
yeah, I appreciate the way you approach things, and I appreciate the fact that it's objective, and you've always been honest, and that's what I expect from my friends and from people in the industry, is to give me an honest answer. Hey man, this is what I think you're doing right, and this is where I think you could improve. I think if we all did that, we would be a lot better, and so would the movement.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the whole point of me really saying that wasn't to put you on a soapbox to talk about how great I am, but
No, 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 no. I
more,
get that. Yeah.
more so to let people know that, you know, my personal relationships certainly do not affect how I go about creating content for the channel, and that even if I were to give you an F for something, of course I would tell you that, but it wouldn't be an option to take it back.
Mm-hmm.
It would just be a courtesy to inform you of your grade, and I often do that with pretty much everyone that I can make contact with in their videos. I give them, I ask them if they would like to know how I feel about it, and surprisingly, most people don't want to know. They would prefer to just see it when it comes out, and that's interesting. What drove you to think that way?
I mean, okay, so kind of coming from the standpoint, I guess, of just being a fan, right? I think for me, it's the artistic side. I know what it's like in the back end to put together, content, do the research, make sure the story makes sense and it's fair on both sides, both aspects, and then the viewer gets to make the decision or come to their own conclusion based off of it, even if I give my input. And you're very similar, and so within that artistic side of things, I just want to be able to, watch it when everybody else watches it, do the same stuff, because I respect the amount of work that goes into it. And so, plus, honestly, again, kind of like I said, I mean, I know you're very similar, but I don't want any special like options. And I think it keeps you in a good place. It keeps me in a good place, and it's organic. And I like that,
Yeah, I appreciate that too, because it definitely, I appreciate it when people have the patience to wait for something like that. And granted, I'm aware of the effect that I may have on how they, go about carrying out their audits or whatever they do. And I definitely don't want to discourage anyone from doing the things that they do just because they make a mistake. And and that goes for police officers as well. Oftentimes I find a police officer who did something bad or wrong, and it doesn't, most of the time, it doesn't make me immediately think that they're a horrible person or a horrible police officer. They just made a mistake. And
Yep.
that's a big part of policing, and it's a big part of work in general. I make mistakes, for example. I mean, I've been corrected many times in the YouTube comments, and it's just
Mm-hmm.
it's a part of the job. You have to be able to take that criticism with grace,
Yeah.
And so far, I will say that pretty much every auditor that I have offered any kind of criticism towards has taken it well, and I've yet to have anyone who was mad because of my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they did, I respect that. Everyone's entitled to thinking the way that they want to think. And as I say all the time, I'm not necessarily an authority on anything really. I just am giving a perspective and providing context. And I don't want people to think that I walk around every day as the king of auditing or anything like that, because that's a far stretch from how I consider myself and what I take into consideration while doing this type of content.
Yeah. I mean, I think two things I want to say actually. So first and foremost, a lot of people, I don't know if they know this, but I want to make sure I put it out there for both of us. And I know, ASD is very similar as well. We do not, like, I don't ask audit to like review my videos. I've actually never asked or submitted anything. I've kind of always just let things happen organically, because I think that that's usually the best way to go, and then you don't have to worry about stuff. But when ATA decided to do the second episode on an audit that I did, I didn't ask him to do that. He didn't, try to do me a favor. It was just a video that he thought would be helpful. And I know ASD is the same way. I'm the same way. When we ask each other things like, hey, I'm going to use your video, is that cool? It's more so a respect thing, but I don't change or ask different questions or do different things, or ATA doesn't either. So we really work, I think, really hard on just trying to be organic about stuff. And then, in terms of credibility and things like that, and an influence, I would say, as much as you don't say it, you are an influence within the community. And I think you're bringing a lot of people to the auditing community that otherwise wouldn't be here, because of the way that you present the information. And it's presented in a way that doesn't like push people to, hate this person or hate that person. It's just, here's the facts, here's what I saw, and here's my own assessment on it. And then your viewers have done a great job and kind of taking it from there, and just it's grown substantially. So I think that that's a credit to your ability as a journalist and a researcher. So yeah, I think it's great.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think, it wasn't really my intention to draw more, people into the auditing community, but that is sort of a byproduct of how this came about. And it was never my intention to, make people believe a certain way about anything. I just really, when I started ATA, it was about bringing some validation to audits and police interactions in general, whether that be on the side of the auditor or the police officer, because many of these interactions take place with absolutely no context. And it's so easy to just draw your conclusions based on misconceptions about the law and about the circumstances surrounding any particular interaction. And that's what I really wanted to get rid of, was get rid of all of the misconceptions, lay down the facts and let them speak for themselves, and provide the context necessary to draw a informed opinion about whatever happened. Because, as everyone knows, social media has crafted this society that just operates on face value. And we see a video on YouTube or Facebook or wherever it's blowing up, and we just take it for what it is. And oftentimes that is not the case. There's so many things about it that just aren't readily available.
Well, and I would say too, I mean, I think there's an element of people within our industry, at least, that is really moving towards trying to add that. I would almost call it like a documentary type feel, right? And this is why I do the audits the way I do it, where I do follow-ups and things like that, because I think that adds, some validity, and it really does. It continues to push that mentality and notion that, hey, look, we're doing research, we're doing follow-ups, and you don't have to just take it at face value. You can see these things. I leave interviews unedited, with law enforcement, stuff like that, because I don't want people to assume that, hey, Rowdy's just kind of milking the system or pushing it in the direction that he wants to. I think we're all trying to. There's a lot of people, I should say, that are trying to move in that direction of a sincere attempt at journalism, and I think that that's good.
Oh, for sure. And I'm glad that that's what's happening. And I believe very much that it is the natural course of any movement. It starts as sort of a disorganized group of people who have a shared idea, and then it evolves into something way more highly organized and that actually produces consistent results. And I think that the auditing community is very much going through that transformation, and oftentimes those transformations take place over the course of several years.
Yeah.
If you look at movements in the past, like the civil rights movement, there's a lot of parallels to how that movement formed and how it became organized that are taking place right now in the still what I would consider the formidable years of this movement. I want to pause for a second here and give a shout out to Charlie Algert. Thank you for that $4.99, and I appreciate what you're saying there about the channel growing. I also want to give a shout out to the DUI guy for joining us, and Solo Yacker as well. Tomorrow there will be a new episode of AtA covering one of Solo Yacker's interactions with the Pinellas County Police Department. And I haven't told him that yet, so I think this is his first time knowing that that's actually done and coming out tomorrow. But I'm sure I'll talk to him later today as well.
That's awesome.
I will probably, speaking of that, I haven't, and this is just to add to the merit of what you were saying about covering, asking to cover each other's videos and all that. You were actually the only auditor, I believe, that I've done 2 videos on. But
Okay.
I have, I'm planning to do a second video on a Solo Yacker interaction as well. So it's not, I don't just play favorites, I guess, when it comes to doing that. I just cover the ones that I think are relevant and have good information.
Yeah. And I think that's important too. I mean, because a lot of people got to realize there's got to be stuff that you feel like, okay, I can share stuff from this on both sides. And I think that's the other thing too, is like not all the time do you pick. I think the first video I had a lower score than the officers did.
I think so. I can't remember though.
I'm pretty sure the first one I had an A and the officers, or I don't remember. I don't remember what it is, and I don't want to speak for you. But basically, it's not like a lot of times it's like where can the auditor improve, right? Like it's so both sides are growing from that, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I want to maintain that element of equality, and equity in that, and holding everyone accountable, because I firmly believe that if you get up off your couch and you make a concerted effort to go out and film the police, you then bear a new burden on yourself, a new set of responsibilities that are attached to this movement as a whole, and you should carry yourself in a way that reflects that. Now, does that mean that you shouldn't, do things that are that I would disagree with? For example, maybe you have an auditing style that's more aggressive, and although I wouldn't do it that way, and I don't think that that's particularly productive and progressive for the entire movement. That doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that I disagree with it, and that's it. And you can take that with a grain of salt. Like I said, I'm not an authority on how people audit. I just have my opinions on how I think, or what would move the entire movement in a more progressive direction.
Yeah.
So it's not, I just want to get that out there as well, that this is not just this is not, my opinion is just my opinion, and that's it. So take that for what you will.
It's kind of part of the First Amendment, right? I mean, we don't have to like what other people do, or how they do it, I should say. Or the fact, I mean, I get a lot of comments too. People are like, get a job. And I'm like, this is my job, but, at the end of the day, people are not going to always, there's no way that you can satisfy everyone. I mean, it just doesn't matter. I think the big part is, can you look at yourself, after you've released that story and thought, okay, like, yeah, I did the right thing in this. I think that's really important. And I think that's how we grow.
Yeah, I agree. And even when I do give harsher grades for certain perspectives and conduct while conducting a First Amendment audit, I also see the value in having a diverse range of auditors who carry themselves in different ways to test all the faculties of the officers that they're interacting with. And so I respect that certain people audit in certain ways, but I also think that though that particular auditing style could have more detrimental effects than someone like, for example, your auditing style would. So that's just where I draw that conclusion. And once again, it's not a slight on the auditor, and it's definitely not saying that they're wrong or they're bad. It's
No, we've
just
even talked about this,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
We
We have.
So I mean, I think at the end of the day, like you said, I mean, the way that I audit is my own kind of way that I feel it should be done. And that doesn't mean that everyone else is wrong, right? It's just how I feel I should do it and conduct myself. Um, there are people that are out there that do it totally differently. They're way more aggressive, and there's times that I will even laugh about it. That being said, that's not how I would go about it. Um, but they challenge the government official in a way that maybe I won't, and then they'll get a reaction that I wouldn't get. You know,
Right.
and I think in auditing, that's another way to test is the level at which an officer may click or a government official may click into letting their emotions and poor judgment control their actions, and I think that's important.
So how would you describe your auditing style? What would you
Um,
what words would you attach to that?
That's a good question. I think I would like to believe a little bit more thorough. Um, just because I'm not going to stop at the moment that I have a bad experience. Then I'm going to see, okay, how willing are we as a department or a government agency to make changes that would effectively you know mitigate this type of situation for another citizen. And then also to show, as I'm releasing stories and things like that, that hey, these folks are trying to make a change, attempt at it. They're not. There's some departments that will not and have not given me an official interview afterwards, and that's okay. But I want to try and continue to be thorough because I think it's important for the agencies that I'm covering, but it's also important for my journalistic approach. And then I would also say I try to be professional, and that's the other word I would attach to it. I really do. I mean, I can be a jerk, and I try not to be. I think you and I have had a couple conversations about the time that I was arrested and kind of my reaction, which was I used some curse words, and I'm not too happy about that.
Right.
I
Just
cur
to give some
Yeah.
clarification on that, Rowdy was arrested after being hit by a car door by a police officer who was getting into an unmarked vehicle, and he was just filming them on a public sidewalk, and the
They were
cop,
saying they were going to leave, and then they didn't.
yeah, and then they basically assaulted him with a door, and he was mad and said,
Hmm.
had vulgar language and ended up getting arrested and whatnot. But we had a discussion about that after it happened, and he was a little bit upset about how he conducted himself in that moment. But I think it's important to consider that we're just human beings, and anyone
Hmm.
who gets hit with a door is going to be really mad about that and say, things out of anger. And I, I just tried to convey that
Yep.
it's just human nature to be mad about getting hit with a door, and
Yeah.
that's outside of the scope of your auditing professionalism. At that point, you've
Well,
transcended that.
and if you look at, like, if you watch the video, I start to get really upset when they grab me, and then, like you said, I was pissed when they hit me with the door, especially when they were telling me originally they were grabbing me so that I would, because I was trying to take a picture of the VIN number. Again, these were undercover officers, undercover vehicle. Of course, they all parked right in front of a police department, so that's neither here nor there. But um, that was what sparks the whole entire thing. And again, if you watch my videos, it's not how I try to conduct business. And I definitely look at auditing as a way of conducting business because my job is to find both good and bad officers, good and bad departments. People that need to be the standard versus people that maybe need some more work in a department that maybe needs some more work. So, yeah, I was pretty pissed. But the way that I look at it, and we've talked about this, I think, recently, but the way that I look at it, um, of course, they dropped the charges and everything like that because they knew there was no case there, and there's still some follow-up stuff that's going on I can't talk about yet. But I was still just disappointed that I didn't keep my composure enough to realize, like, okay, these guys obviously have some issues, and we're gonna have to work on this. And so I'll just be quiet in terms of my vulgarity. I still regret doing that. Not that it wasn't justified, but just that, I don't know.
Yeah, no,
Well,
I mean, I see where you're coming from, and speaking strictly from like a case perspective, it's always better to not, use
hmm
vulgarities and retain your professionalism. But like I said, it's not like anyone's gonna hate you for being a human being, and I'm sure even in the courtroom, that would translate. But I want to pivot a little bit here, and
sure.
so many people probably don't know this about you, but you spent some time in the military, and
hmm
I was wanting to ask you, how does that time? There's two questions with this, and I'll just ask you the first one. How did that time in the military translate to you becoming an auditor and developing your style?
That's a great question. I think a couple of people asked me that, in passing, and I think the biggest part to that is that the being scared versus completing the task or mission. They're two very different things in the way that I look at them and the way that I execute them. And so, for the most part, besides the situation we talked about earlier, my emotions are generally going to stay at a maintained level during chaos. And I've learned that through military experience and 3 deployments, and the kind of training and the type of organization that I was with when I was in the military. So chaos to me is comfortable. And so when I'm detained or having a conversation that maybe things aren't going the way that I think they should, or sometimes they go completely the wrong way and I end up in jail for a little bit, I'm okay. Just because mentally I'm kind of prepared for whatever needs to happen, and being able to assess the situation for the most part as good as I can, and make a sound decision in how I'm going to react. Like I said, that there's that one time that I didn't, but 90% of the time, I think that's where all of my kind of the way that the professionalism, the way that I speak, I try to use kind of a lower voice. I don't want to elevate too much. I try to emphasize like a positive type conversation where I de-escalate things. I try to be positive and have a conversation too, just because I've worked with a lot of people all over the world, different scenarios that are all, serious scenarios. And a lot of times there's still a way to de-escalate things and kind of come to some general understanding and humanization and then go from there. And I try to do that, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can definitely see how being exposed to stressful situations, like on a battlefield or in training or whatever it may be, would translate to having good skills as an auditor. And so, one more question about that is, in the military, you have a hierarchical structure of
hmm
authority. And I'm wondering how you went from being sort of a cog in the wheel of hierarchy to, stopping those cogs out on the street, being an auditor and sort of defying all of the authority that comes with policing. So, what changed your mind about authority and how it should be distributed? You know?
That's a good question. In fact, that's the first time anyone's asked me that. I would almost say that because two things, because of my service and experience working for the government and as a government employee, so to speak, um, I kind of learned where shortcomings naturally happen. There was a saying that we used to have, which was "good enough for government work." It was kind of a joke, but it was also kind of a serious thing. Like, you know, it's one of when you're 19 years old and you're picking, I don't know, rocks up off the, out of this thing, or picking leaves out of a rock bed, and it's really stupid. And you're going, okay, well, I'm good enough for government work, stuff like that. And there's a way that almost everyone falls in or settles into this kind of lackadaisical thought process when they work for the government in a certain aspect. And so when you become complacent like that, a lot of times it's the leadership that will check you. if the leadership doesn't check you, and there's not an expectation of checks and balances, then that ideology kind of runs rampant throughout a whole entire organization and can really turn it into a less productive organization. And so seeing that and knowing that, and being used to being checked is what helped me in understanding that the government in general needs to be checked, or things will continue to slowly go downhill. And so I guess I would say that it's the fact that I was in the military, that, and I was a cog in that wheel, that I understand how it rolls and where the loose parts are, and and I think I would like to think that it adds some validity to my opinion in a certain aspect. There was one incident, actually, to give another example. This happened twice. One time when I got arrested. The other time was recently at Blue Earth County. They were talking about undercover vehicles they had at the back of their police or their sheriff's department. And I said, I was in special operations for 5 years. That's not an excuse. Like, if you don't want people to know where you are, what you're doing, what you're rolling around in, don't put it in the spot that you can associate it with that.
Right.
I mean, so it's stuff like that I use, and I kind of, there's times, and I think a lot of civilians can't necessarily say that, like, oh, okay, well, it's undercover vehicles, that must mean something, that maybe I'm wrong. And I'm going, well, let's start with just logic. I've been in this scenario. I've worked with anyone you can think of, honestly, within the special operations community, from the United States as well as other of our allies. People don't do stupid things like that and then have a unlogical thought process afterwards. So I try to bring that in and say, like, look, here's where I come from, here's why I think my opinion is valid, and here's why I think that what you're saying doesn't make much sense. And so I use that too.
Right. I mean, I could see how having an intimate understanding of how authority really operates and all of the problems with it would definitely, lead someone to thinking that, well, maybe I can fix that, in some way. And, in some way, shape, or form, maybe that can translate into something positive with that type of experience.
Yeah.
How do you see objectivity in your channel, and how does that play a role in how you go about creating your content and your auditing?
I think it's tough. From a certain aspect, there's a problem. I mean, my channel's designed to call out and show problems that exist, as well as positive reinforcement on law enforcement's doing the right thing. So I feel like that's really where it comes into play, because I'm showing both sides, and I'm not afraid. Now, those videos are not nearly going to get the amount of traction that maybe an officer arresting me or me, I don't want to say winning, because it's not really about winning, but me implementing my rights properly. Usually those will go a lot higher. If somebody challenges me on my rights and I challenge back, generally speaking, those videos skyrocket. And the ones that maybe I put out where it's an interview of a police chief, that that'll get 1/10 of the amount of traction or views or listens, but it's still there. And so for me, I think that's important, because then I can say that I'm objective when doing this. I try to give credit where credit's due, and I believe that you should shame just as much, or you should appreciate and acknowledge just as much as you shame. So if there's a good cop, go ahead and obviously point it out. But when there's a bad cop, you got to do that just as well. And so treat those things equally. Because I think there's a lot of times, a lot of people just make a statement like all cops are bad, or all cops are racist, or all cops are this, or all cops are that. And then the other side is the same exact thing. No cops are racist. No cops are bad. All cops are good, and there are heroes. And the reality is, that's not possible. It wasn't possible in the military, and it's not possible in law enforcement. And I don't think we should expect them to all be perfect. What we do need to do is expect that as a society, we're going to hold those accountable that need to be held accountable when they've done something bad or wrong or made a mistake even.
Yeah, and like you said, it is extremely important to highlight good policing, but it seems to get lost in the ocean of all the bad policing. And I think one thing that a lot of people who dive into this auditing niche, not just auditors, but also viewers of this content, they tend to forget the fact that there are, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of police interactions taking place every day. And not all of them are bad. And as a matter of
Yep.
fact, a majority of them are probably boring, mundane, and, cops just doing his job and somebody got a
Hmm.
speeding ticket or whatnot. So it's difficult to combat the media narratives that, this is a black or white issue. And I don't mean that in terms of race, but just in terms of perspectives. It's not like anyone has the right answer here. And it's everything is a gray area. And
Hmm.
that gray area is relative to all things in life. Life is more complex than what can be condensed down into a 2-minute news segment. And
Yep.
it's just important to bear that in mind when you're watching my content or your content or anyone's content within the auditing community.
Well, and
Um,
I think we're all trying to like I said earlier, we're adding, validity to what we're doing. A lot of times when people watch news, I think this is why people get frustrated with the news, and I think this is why things like what you do and what I do and other completely different genres do, whether it's politics or whatever, people are going to create their own things. I mean, there's so much technology that we can use now that those sources and platforms are already having a really hard time retaining an audience. And meanwhile, we're building one because I think people can see the intent that we're trying to, remain objective. That's why I think your channel does so well, to be honest with you, is because it's probably one of the best examples of an objective look at something within our industry. You know.
objectivity is an extremely important thing. And I think that implicit biases play a role no matter what you do.
Hmm.
But the important thing is to be aware of those and actively work to combat those biases and, just gain a deeper understanding of yourself and your own biases and how those affect the way that you create things. And that's something that I am striving even now to do because there are still ways, even though, I've built this whole foundation trying to say, hey, this is objective content, I'm giving fair grades and whatnot. You can look on my channel and see that it's
Yep.
pretty rare that officers get a good grade. And, there's many elements going into that. And I would say that bias probably does play a role in the videos that I choose to make, but it's not the only thing contributing to that. Bias
Correct.
often sits in the back seat of, what is actually driving your content. And I can't sit here and make videos about all these positive police interactions and expect to build an audience on that because there's
Hmm.
simply not a market for it. And I also can't sit here and praise auditors constantly without being thrown into a particular, narrative
Category.
about
Yep.
that. Yeah. So I try to maintain a decent balance of covering good cops and bad cops, but it's impossible to do that and maintain the influence that comes along with having a channel like this. So I will say that bias may come into play when I choose a video,
Hmm.
but it also comes into play with entertainment value and marketability and all the other things that just come with being on YouTube in general.
Yep.
So it's almost inescapable to do what any of us do without introducing some amount of bias, and it's just really important to acknowledge that.
Well, and you have to remember too that perspective is reality, right? So, one of your viewers or listeners, their perspective is going to be their reality, and so their experiences inevitably will have some sort of subconscious bias, in how they interpret the data or information that's shown to them. And it's the same thing that goes with when we present that data and information. That being said, do we make a conscious effort to try and put stuff out there that may contradict what people think we feel, so that we are kind of leveling the playing field, so to speak? I think one of the hardest things that I have, honestly, is like when I come across a cop that really disappoints me, because I innately have a issue with, I have to express like I'm disappointed. And so sometimes it's really hard to you know not let your bias overtake your reaction, and how you even put the video together, all those things. I mean, it's a lot of different stuff, so it's
Right.
interesting.
I gotta say and give ASD credit for those previous questions I asked you, because those came from him. And
Okay.
he has one more here that I would like to throw into the mix, and that is, what do you have to say about to the people out there saying that you're just looking for trouble by
Oh,
filming
I
police
love that.
officer?
That is probably one of my most favorite comments that I get. So a lot of people think, like, as your channel grows, and it's obviously I'm a different spot than you are, ATA, but as your channel grows, like, people think you stop reading the comments, and I don't. So it's kind of one of those things where, like, I read the comments, and I have a whole bunch that are like, get a job, get a life, you're just out there looking for trouble. And yeah, I kind of am. Yep. I'm not going to deny that. Here's the thing. So what I always tell people is, when an officer's doing their job, because generally people that say that are saying that the officer should be left alone, and that you are, kind of the bad actor, so to speak, in this scenario or situation. So a lot of times I ask that individual, if you're going to judge me on that grade, what do you give the officer that sets up the speed trap, or the officer that goes undercover to buy drugs and then arrest the sale, or the person that's selling the drugs? So what do you say to the officer who sets up a prostitution sting? Those types of things. I mean, they're obviously looking for trouble. When you get pulled over, the first thing you say isn't, God, you're out here looking for trouble, aren't you? First thing you say is, shit, was I speeding? Maybe you know what you did, whatever it may be, but you're looking at yourself. And so what I'd like to do is try to change that perspective of people to say, hey, look, this guy's not out there, doing bad things. He's out there legally trying to find a way to either expose good departments and give them the credit that they deserve, or expose bad departments and make the change that they should make. Just like when we get pulled over, they're looking to leave the good drivers away, and that's an immediate positive reinforcement that you weren't breaking the law bad enough for you to attract the attention of the officer. Hopefully at some point people think the same thing about auditors. Those of us that are trying to be professional, yes, we are out looking for a bad officer or a bad department, but I'm also out looking for a good department. That's one of the benefits in the job that I have that law enforcement generally does not do, is I also give props and credit and showcase good departments and good officers and good leadership teams, and ask them why they do those things differently. So I'd almost say, if anything, I'm the one that's out there looking for less trouble. Not that I'm upset with cops for pulling people over, because that's not what I'm saying. But so that's what I would say to somebody. And I often ask people that, and a lot of times the response that I get is, well, it's different. Not really. No, it's not. They're a human being, and they have a badge. I'm a human being, and I have a camera, and I have a platform. And so everyone and anyone is capable. That's the beauty of checks and balances. I mean, the people are what inevitably elect the officials that pass the laws, and appoint other individuals and get things done for us. And so that works its way all the way down to the officers.
Yeah, and I would like to address a comment here that Kelly Kaku says, that says you're definitely baiting officers on duty, which is probably a crime somewhere, somehow, by using up police resources when you're not intending to specifically break any laws. Now, first of all, you're absolutely 100% completely wrong about that. And here's why. If someone who's exercising a well-established protected right under the government ends up being, causing trouble, quotation marks, with a police officer, who's really causing the trouble there? It's the officer who's wasting the resources by making contact with someone who is doing something completely legal, and it is not, there's no way that is your fault as the auditor, particularly with your style where you don't confront them. You don't walk up to them. You put the hands of where this interaction goes into the hands of the police officers. And that type of auditing style does not cause trouble. It's the officers who cause the trouble with that style. And it's ridiculous to have that perspective that Kelly Kaku has there, that somehow you're baiting the police officers by minding your own business and recording the things around you in public. And
Well, and
somehow that translates to trouble.
I think the other problem too, and this is where it does get difficult, because a lot of people don't realize or see, because, okay, I'll give you an example. And Sarah's 100% right. So Sarah says you're not breaking a law by just existing. But to your point, a lot of people don't see the behind the scenes, what happens. Like 90% of the time, I'm walking around like a building randomly, or I'm like walking around the outside of the building. I'm in the parking lot looking at squad cars. I'm not approaching a law enforcement officer to then create a problem. And if you go back and you look, here's how you can tell. Excuse me. If you look at the videos, it oftentimes starts with the officer making their approach and initiating conversation and contact with me. And that is the test, right? So, but I would also say the difference in what, and I'm going to butcher his name, I do apologize, Kelikaku. The difference in what he's saying, if we take that, and again, we just add some logic and different perspective to it. And I'm not saying you're illogical, Kelikaku, but I'm just saying that there's a way to look at this, from the other shoe. If you were to say that to a rape victim, which is a very serious issue, would you say, well, they were wearing a low-cut skirt, so they were looking for, or low-cut dress and a high skirt, they were looking for trouble? No, we don't say that. It's not illegal to do what she is doing or he is doing. It's illegal to hurt somebody, do bad things to somebody. It's the same thing when I'm walking around a public building, filming, I don't know, cop cars or whatever it is that our tax dollars go to. I'm not in an area I'm not supposed to be. I'm just filming. That's not illegal. That can't be illegal, because if that's illegal, then guess what else becomes illegal? At that point in time, then you start to say things like, well, I was out walking my dog. Okay, well, we've had some crime or issues in this area, so we just want to see your ID. We just want to make sure we know who you are. That's a very real scenario that happens a lot. And so by me going out into a public building and welcoming any conversation, whether that be confrontational or whether that be, extremely, respectful, it's up to them. I can't set the stage. And my goal is always to say, you guys can, the officer's going to make the decision whether they're going to be looked at as, a quote unquote bad guy, or they're going to be looked at as, hey, the cop asked some questions and left, and that was it, and respected their rights when you implemented them. That's fine. I mean, that's what people should be doing. But to say that we're looking for trouble, I mean, this is a common view. I give him Kalakaku some props for at least saying it in the open, but you're right. I mean, that's a common view that people have, is like, you're looking for trouble, you are wrong. And the sad thing is, what people should be saying is, wow, okay, cool. How can I also help make a difference? How can I look for the bad stuff so we don't have cities burning, we don't have things happening? It's all our responsibilities.
And I'd just like to
soapbox speech. Sorry.
to add about taking advantage of the officer's ignorance is another thing that Kelly Kaku brought up. But I would like to say that officers take advantage of people's ignorance of the law every single day, all the time. And there's never an interaction that you're going to have with police officers where they don't try to take advantage of their knowledge of the law and your lack of knowledge of the law. And you can look at every single video on my channel and see that. What was the case that the Supreme Court ruled that ignorance of a law is not an excuse for the law? Yeah,
correct.
I can't remember the actual name of that case. I haven't looked at that one in a while, but yeah, that is case law. And that also applies to police officers. Their ignorance of the law does not excuse their actions. I mean, in the courtroom it may, considering that we have qualified immunity, but that doesn't mean that it's morally acceptable within our society to do stuff like that. It's just, if we are going to exist in a society where police officers have this much power, that ignorance should not be such a deep divide between them and the people that it causes people to be taken advantage of on either side. So if a
Yep.
police officer is ignorant of the law, that is their problem. It is not you should not be held accountable for exposing that as if you're doing something bad.
Yep. And that's it's I'm gonna ruin the words, but ignorantia juris non excusat. It's Latin for
Latin,
basically
yeah.
ignorance of the law excuses not. And that is the thing. Okay, if it's kind of like that Dave Chappelle skit where they're making the joke and he's like, I didn't know I couldn't do that, Dave. Or the officer, and then he looked at Dave Chappelle and he's like, I didn't know, Dave is pretending to be a white guy. But reality is a lot of times you can tell a cop, well, I didn't know it was 55 here. Well, there's a sign. It doesn't matter. The information was available to you. You just chose not to retain it and use it and implement it in order to avoid trouble. That's not the cop's fault, right? If I didn't look at the speed limit sign's still there. The law still exists. It's not the cop's fault that I wasn't paying attention. It's the same goes for the auditor or the citizen. Uh, you know, it's the same that goes for the officer. Just because the officer doesn't realize that I'm doing something that's constitutionally protected, that's not my problem. It's not my fault either.
Especially considering that they were specifically trained on all of this information, so
Yeah, because it pertains to their job every single time they interact with an individual.
right. And it's not your responsibility, so to speak, as a citizen to understand the law as deeply as a police officer does. Although you probably should, but there's no mandated training for citizens to understand the law, whereas they have 18 to 22 or some odd weeks to learn about all that. Mm-hmm. And so holding their ignorance against them is something that I think should be done so that they don't make the same mistakes over and over.
Well, and the reality is too, right? So, and I want to touch on something you said that I think is like so important and something that's almost scary to me. If you look at how citizens show their understanding and acknowledgement of laws or lack thereof, it's scary because most citizens don't actually pay attention or even do any research when it comes to these laws. And I'll give you one example, and it's something that you called out earlier. Cops use and take advantage of people's, lack of understanding, so to speak, when they ask for ID. Asking a passenger of a vehicle for ID, depending on the scenario, as you know, isn't necessarily a requirement for that passenger to show ID. Now, there's some examples anyone could come up with to say, well, there is times in which you would have to. I'll give you an example. Let's say that a vehicle was suspected to be involved in a robbery, and there were several individuals that were involved in said robbery. They pull over a vehicle that matches the description with multiple occupants in the vehicle. At that point in time, I would understand an officer asking for, identification, date of birth, something. Now, let's say somebody's speeding and the officer and their partner walk up to the vehicle. Maybe it's state patrol. This is a very common incident or occurrence. And then the partner asks the person, or the officer asks the person, what's your name and can I have your ID as well? A lot of people just give it to them. Why? You don't have to. You got to understand and ask the right questions. And I think that there's a lot of work that goes into being an auditor behind the scenes, where we do a lot of research and have a lot of conversations and reading and case law studying and all those fun things. But I think every citizen should be taught and understand just the fundamentals of their constitutional rights. And I don't think education systems have done enough to implement that.
If anything,
it's almost a fear. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think people talk about the Constitution, but give the students a quiz. What does the First Amendment do? What does the Second Amendment do? You know what I mean?
And I think also give them practical examples of how that applies to everyday life. And that's one thing that I think has made the channel successful, is because we all learn about the Constitution in school. We all learn about certain rights that we may have in social studies and whatnot, but we are never given practical examples of them being used and being invoked in everyday situations, particularly involving police officers, because that's where most of our rights are centered. Most of our rights come into play when we're interacting with members of law enforcement, or when we're interacting with our government as a whole. So it's definitely a big gap in our education And it's definitely something that I think should be um, put into the curriculum in some way, shape, or form. You know, if we're going to have poorly trained police officers walking the streets, then we need to have highly trained citizens walking the streets to understand the difference between those and to make sure that checks and balances are going on both sides.
Hmm. Yeah, and an understanding of why we have those too, right? Because I think a lot of times, especially right now, one of the disadvantages of social media is there is some false narratives that are being spread on either side. I don't like to talk about sides specific, but everywhere there is misinformation being sent out all over, and so what people need to realize is that I have every right to say my beliefs, my opinions, but you have every right to fact check them and then come to your own conclusion based off of the research that you've done. And any politician, law enforcement officer, city or state level government, all of those things need to be researched and fact checked. And it's not just because of candidates or this or that. It needs to be looked at because you should have an understanding of where they're coming from and why they have the beliefs that they have, and then does that match up with case law, your beliefs, the current situations and circumstances that that community or state is in, or country even. But how do you make the changes? And so I wrote this down real quick while you were talking. A lot of people think like you can make these changes at the law enforcement level. It's not even close to scratching the surface of the law enforcement level and the issues that we're seeing as a country right now. Actually, that's that's kind of that's the symptoms of a problem that's way deeper, right? And so we could band-aid the law enforcement part, but if we did these three things, I think you would have an actual change. And that would be working with law enforcement, educating our youth, and then managing our local government and holding them accountable for the things that the other two, right? So if education part doesn't come into play and they don't actually work on that with their city council and school board and those types of things, you can really screw yourself. And then accountability over law enforcement, so making sure those local officials know that their seat is going to be determined based off of the actions that people think need to be prioritized. And so if they're not working on those things and obviously don't care about it, remove them. We have those rights. And so if we don't do all three things, educate ourselves, pay attention and control law enforcement, and then hold government accountable to also do those things, and then make the changes properly in terms of policies and legislation, we're screwed. So
I
that's how
agree.
you fix it.
I think there's also another element that should definitely be considered, which is psychology, and the
Mm-hmm.
fact that anytime you give someone a certain amount of power, that results in an abuse of that power most of the time. I mean, you can look at the most famous, of course, demonstration of this is the Stanford prison experiment. And if you haven't heard of that, or if you don't know what that is, I highly suggest taking a look at that. That would give you a lot of insight as to how these officers end up being how they are, and whether or not it's really has to do with as Corey and I discussed on the last episode of this radio show, psychology of police officers is one of the most under researched and most important aspects of the job that gets none of the limelight, and
Mm-hmm.
that is certainly a something that should be funded and looked into, and ways to figure out how you can mitigate the psychological implications of being a police officer.
Yep.
Um,
Well,
uh,
it's very similar with the military too, because overseas, and a lot of people don't understand this feeling, right? But overseas, when we're going into houses and we're doing this and that, and it's a totally different scenario, trust me. But there are a lot of regulations and there are a lot of conversations that happen and investigations that happen to ensure that the Geneva Convention is being met and that laws are being followed and that shootings that take place are justified, etc. Overseas, right? There's rules of engagement. There's all kinds of different stuff. In fact, somebody pointed out to me too that like law enforcement doesn't have ROEs, but the military does, and that's something that I think is important. But how do we as a community start to make these changes? And the psychology is very important. But we all in the military, when we go into people's houses, you just kind of, the psychology is this, that you're on the good side. So you automatically associate yourself as a good person. And there's a reason why you're here based off of intelligence, et cetera, that we know that there are some bad actors within this house, or maybe all of them are. But when you get that I'm good and I'm the powerful one and they're bad and they're the ones that need to be dealt with, depending on where you're at, that can be very, very sketchy. And so doing that in your country with your own, countrymen and women is a different story. And it's a slippery slope that psychologically speaking can really start to differentiate yourself from those that you're supposed to be serving and protecting.
Right.
Right.
And Corey and I talked about this a lot on the last episode, and I highly recommend checking that out. Corey has a lot of good information about this, and he's somewhat of an expert on on the mindset and mentality of police officers and how outside factors and the things that they encounter in their everyday lives and while on the job affect who they are as a person. And but I want to give a little bit of a sneak preview, so to speak, of something, because Keelan Fitzpatrick said in the comments earlier that someone should create an app for when you are confronted by police that can easily be used to help inform the citizen. And I'm currently working on a project that is in the same vein as that. It will be, I guess I can just say that I'm working on a book that will hopefully help people with that. And I'm not exactly sure on a timeline for it yet. Just know that it is in production, and that John and I will be talking about that at some point in the future on his podcast. And you should definitely go to his channel and check out the links for his podcast as well. I've actually appeared on it in the past. As we discussed earlier, that's sort of how we came to know each other. So definitely take the time to check out his podcast as well. And I want to go ahead and open the chat and the calls. If you want
one thing I do want to say before we do that real quick.
Sure.
I think it's important that everyone understand that if you're filming the police, if you get pulled over and you turn a camera on, it's okay. Don't feel like you're being rude or you're being a jerk. Be professional, speak professional, have the camera rolling, because any interaction that you have with law enforcement is an interaction in which your rights, your liberties are at stake. Okay. And I'm not saying that cops are bad and they're looking for a reason to put you away, but you should assume that no matter what, everything is in play and is always in play. When somebody's wearing a badge and they're having a conversation with you in a on the record type situation, you should be rolling that camera.
Yeah, cops are not your friends. Cops are not your friends. They're going to pretend to be your friends. That's their job. And you should never feel that you're being rude for exercising your rights. So don't let anyone convince you of that. Feel free to throw your questions in the chat. I have another thing that I want to talk about, a news story. But go ahead and throw some questions up and we'll get to those. And if you want to call in, you can. All you have to do is dial the number according to what time zone you're in, put in the meeting ID and the passcode. If it asks you for your participant ID, you can just press pound to skip that part. It's a little bit of a process, but feel free to call in and jump in.
Yeah, call in if you can. I like calling. That'd be cool. I've never done it before.
So the first thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to bring this over into the screen here so you all can see this article. So the Breonna Taylor case is something that that I've been considering doing a video on, and this new piece of information that recently came out is something that I wanted to share with you all. And so the Louisville judge who signed the search warrants for Breonna's, for her apartment to be raided, thinks that maybe the officer, who is this guy right here, Joshua Janes, might have lied about what information he used to secure that warrant. And here is what he said was that he told the judge that he was working on information that he got from the postal worker, from the postal inspector, which is, I believe, is a sort of a police element of of the Postal Service that works closely with departments to, track down suspicious packages and stuff like that. And the inspector, the postal inspector, told this officer that there was no suspicious packages going to Brianna's home, but yet he filled out an affidavit that suggested that there actually was suspicious packages going to her home, and ended up securing the search warrant to go in there. Now, I'm definitely not saying that this is the only element of this case that you should consider, but I haven't seen this information making the rounds so much in social media, and I do think that it's something everyone should know about this case. And I wanted to ensure that my audience was aware of that, and just put together a more, hopefully inform you guys a little bit more about some of the things surrounding her. So what do you think about that, man? What do you think about, because I believe that's probably common practice for police officers to lie to get an affidavit. And we'll get to our call in just a moment after this, but I just want to get a quick take from you on that.
So from the whole, first and foremost, they're human. So you're going to have humans that maybe it's beneficial for them to, fib, lie, flat out mislead. You're going to have individuals that do that. And so I think in those cases and in those scenarios, I would like to see laws that come out like that as a federal law, to be able to charge people to the fullest extent. I think those officers or individuals, anyone who, files a false police report, affidavit, those types of things, should be punished. And especially those that are trying to use that in order to invade somebody else's rights. So that's imperative. And the other thing about Breonna Taylor that's very interesting is there is still a lot that's unknown regarding, how things went down. And maybe we'll never know the truth about what all went down in the apartment. I think there's other cases or other scenarios that I've watched. So it's a little bit easier for me to give some sort of thought process. But I guess for this, I would say that person should go to jail. And they should be charged with a felony, I think. And they've also incited riots and things like that.
Coincidentally enough, the grand jury did not indict them, of course. So we'll see how that
Which is
plays
disappointing.
out. Yeah, for sure. All right, let's take this call and see what we got here. Hey, welcome to the radio show. You got a question?
Hello, yes. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
What's your name, or what do you go by?
Call me Nick.
Nick, okay.
Nick. So, I'm watching this since the beginning, and you guys really talked a lot of good points. And I've been watching a lot of auditors lately, and the one thing I want to kind of touch on is when they go out there and they're doing their audits or whatever they're doing, if it's a First Amendment or a Second Amendment audit. You say it's a First Amendment audit, and you're filming whatever it is. You're on your public roadway or sidewalks, let's say, and the officer comes out, and I want to kind of get your guys' perspective on when they're talking to you, which is okay, but and they start kind of, I wouldn't say harassing yet, but saying that you're a suspicious person. It's not like we have a lot of people doing what you're doing here, and they're just kind of keeping harassing you by trying to get you to identify yourself. How do you ever think that suspicion of what you're doing, which is constitutionally right and it's protected, do you think that suspicion will go away, or can we maybe get that suspicion down and not make it so high?
You're talking overall?
Overall, yeah. Like what auditors do. Do you think officer suspicion, which is not a crime, it's not a crime whatsoever, but would you think that could go away, or at least we can bring it down to where while it's okay for officers to come out and talk to you, I have no problem with that because we see it all the time. But do you think that, they're saying it's suspicious, it's not a lot of things, and then they start, kind of asking you for ID and keep asking you and, illegally detain you? Do you think that that will ever, go away, or we can just like bring it down?
Well,
So, oh, go ahead.
I think that first of all, there's definitely been less of that happening. And I'm just going to mute you here for a second because I'm getting a little bit of echo. There's definitely been less of that happening over the course of time as the auditing community has become more organized, and I think it'll be less of a factor in the future. As the auditing community becomes more prevalent and more people start doing this, officers will have less and less of an excuse for assuming that suspicious activity is going on, and that will eventually solve the problem. But as for right now, I don't really have an answer for that. If you want to try to tackle that, Rowdy.
So I guess you're gonna have two types of actions that could cause a change in that. Two would be legislatively, and then the second part to that action that would make a change would be we the people. And so, yeah, I think there's going to be a part where after a while, if everyone starts to say, okay, you're suspicious, that's fine. You ask me questions, that's fine. But, and you're an officer, so you should be, by nature, inquisitive and curious to see what somebody's doing. But the more and more that people start to say, yeah, I'm not going to answer that, and they start filming and they start doing these things, then we get them conditioned to that type of reality. Right now, the reality is if they say, can I see your ID, just because you're suspicious, people just hand it to them. And so by nature, then it is suspicious for somebody to say no. But if the majority of people understand their rights and implement them properly, then that becomes the new norm. And so now you essentially checkmate them. I mean, that's the number one way to do it. And the number two, obviously, is to have legislation that's passed that would say, hey, you can't just approach people. But again, that's still going to take the citizens to call them out and file complaints in order to actually get that addressed then. Because if they break the rules but nobody knows about it, then it doesn't matter.
Well, I think that's where filming them comes into play a lot, and making sure that everyone understands that they can film the police, and not just that, but they actually do it. And of course, we know now that that's becoming more and more normalized as well. So it seems as though, to me, and this is just my opinion, that the auditing community is making a difference and has at least made some kind of impact on whether or not people understand what they can and can't do during police interactions. And I get that's what motivates me to keep doing these videos, and not transition into something else. But for now, I think there's still a lot of work to be done as far as making, not just with your question, Nick, but with just rights in general. There's still a lot of progress to be made before people aren't considered suspicious for doing a constitutionally protected thing. So we'll see how that goes in the future. And I've sent you an unmute request. I'm not exactly sure how to make that happen, but I guess we'll just end your call there. And thank you for calling in.
Yeah, thanks, Nick.
I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, and I would say one other thing I would add to that too is, like, I think over time, the one alpha community or First Amendment auditing community has gotten the respect in a certain aspect, right, from law enforcement, because now they kind of know, like, oh shit, if somebody walks up with a camera, probably a First Amendment auditor. And I've had officers say to their partners, oh, he's a First Amendment auditor. And so they are aware of the community and what we're doing. It doesn't mean everyone is, and it doesn't mean that enough people are. And unfortunately, I shouldn't have a job right now, because most law enforcement agencies should just see us and there should be nothing, and it should be super boring and no one should ever watch. But the reality is that as long as there's going to be law enforcement and government, there's going to be issues with people making the wrong decisions that we trust. And that's okay, that happens, as long as we fix it. It doesn't mean that it's broken. It just means we need to fix it when we see it.
Right. Feel free to call in. All you have to do is um, dial by your time zone, put in that code, and put in the meeting ID. If it asks you for your participant ID, you can just hit pound. Or you can also join us online. You have all the information there. And I'm going to go ahead and hit a few questions in the chat. Jacob Randall says, what happened to the original guy who used to do these? He had terrible audio, but I stuck with it because it was interesting. Well, that's me. I'm still doing these. Maybe a little bit better audio now, but I've hired a narrator to take over just reading scripts that I give him. I still do all the research, curate the videos, send all the emails, call the departments, edit the videos, all that. And nothing has changed outside of someone else reading the words.
And, you know, what's funny too, ATA, is that so the guy that does your voiceover stuff, he does voiceovers for other stuff on YouTube as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of funny because like I'll hear him, you know, now, and it's like, oh, there he is again, you know.
Yeah.
And obviously, I always peg him as ATA narrator, but yeah, most people I don't think know. There's not two different people running ATA. It's ATA runs ATA, and then he has a voice person that does the recordings.
Right, and I have intentionally not tried to sign him to an exclusivity contract or anything like that because I understand what it's like to work as a freelancer, and oftentimes you lose more money than you ever get by signing exclusivity contracts. I have no problems with him narrating other things, and I hope he does. I mean, that just means that he's doing well in his field. And you never know, there may come a point in time where I resume doing the narration, and perhaps once I, do some reveal an identity and whatnot, maybe I'll take on another role as far as how the channel operates. And we have another caller, so let's get them in here. Hey, caller, you're on the radio show. What's up?
Hi. Thank you so much for your content. Please keep up the good work.
Thank you.
You already answered one of my questions. I'm Kelly Kaku.
Oh, yeah. Nice to talk to you.
It's an honor to talk to you, sir, for all the good work that you do.
Thank you.
So I put this in the chat, but maybe I can ask it verbally. So we were mentioning the 1A community, and I know there's also another community called the Sovereign Citizen community, where there's a couple of terms for those people, but they don't recognize the government in certain ways. They're sovereign
right
citizens.
of free travel and all that stuff. Yep.
Okay, so there may be some overlap, I guess, philosophically, but do 1A auditors have an issue with the law enforcement people confusing them with sovereign citizens?
Oh, yeah.
That's my question.
100%. And it's a very valid reason to not confuse the two, because for one, not only are the sovereign citizen movement built on an entire foundation of illogical ideas and antiquated case law and, many things that just kind of erode the credibility of the movement as a whole, but it has also been deemed a terrorist organization by the FBI. So there is very serious connotations attached to being called a sovereign citizen, and it's very definitely not something that you would want to be associated with, especially when you're trying to create a cohesive movement that has an end goal that is respectable. And and John, since you're an auditor, I mean, what's your take on that?
I think that's a really good question, actually, and I'm actually really happy that you asked that. So a lot of times law enforcement, like you said, will kind of confuse us. Oh, is this a sovereign citizen type person? And there's actually kind of a joke amongst the auditing community that says, no, that's you guys. And the reason that joke exists is because in the First Amendment auditing community, or 1 Alpha community, our goal is to utilize the law and stay within the confines of the law, whether that's local, state, or federal. to ensure that we don't end up going to jail and we actually prove our point, or showcase an officer that doesn't follow the law or doesn't respect our rights, or to showcase departments that do. And so the other thing that you would run into a lot of times for a First Amendment auditor is that they would end up going to jail far more often. And it wouldn't be for charges like contempt of cop, or essentially, disorderly conduct,
public nuisance, loitering,
yeah, public
stuff
nuisance,
like
infringing on a legal process, those types of things. I mean, those are the kind of things that we get charged with, and oftentimes get dropped because there's no merit or basis for them when you start to look at case law. The other part too is that sovereign citizens take facts and case law, and then they add another whole level of interpretation that doesn't exist, and that is not how First Amendment auditors want to be recognized, and that's not what we do. And I think that's why, because it almost discredits like the amount of research and stuff that we do, and the fact that we try to abide by the law, whereas they just try to say that law doesn't pertain to them. So that's kind of bothersome in and it's of its own self. But on top of that, I think there's also kind of the factor that we make the joke that the cops are the sovereign citizens, some of them, because they don't think the law pertains to them, or that they have to follow people's constitutional rights, and that they almost have like a junior G-man card where it's that badge is supposed to mean that you don't have to abide by the law, and you can kind of make stuff up as you go and then enforce that as a legal order, and that's not the case either. So good question, but no, we definitely are not sovereign citizens. We don't appreciate or take kindly to somebody saying that.
The police have qualified immunity, and the sovereign citizens just have their own ideology.
Correct. And so for qualified immunity, I mean, that's another thing too, is like they're protected on top of that. Now, if they break the law, theoretically qualified immunity is supposed to go out the window. But the problem is oftentimes some are seeing that the threshold for qualified immunity is not always met, but it seems like they're receiving qualified immunity more than they should. And I think that's part of the problem that the country's going through and trying to address, reform. But I think you can be, because I'm very pro-government, I'm very pro-Constitution, I'm very pro-America. I think you can be pro-police, pro-America, pro-Constitution, and also hold, bad or misconduct accountable. I think that should be the normal consensus from every citizen of the country. That's my view, is people should just say, like, I don't like bad cops and I like good cops. I think that's how we should be.
Well, and I think that is probably the dominating narrative surrounding, all this stuff, no matter how much the media would like us to believe that everyone either hates cops or loves cops. I think that the majority of Americans are probably somewhere in the middle and have sensible opinions on all of this. It's just that they don't have the platforms to express those opinions, and the media is not going to showcase someone who has an idea or a perspective that doesn't align with the ones that generate them advertising revenue. So it's just
thank you for everything that you do. It must take nerves of steel to go through getting arrested and dealing with police officers like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, to be honest with you, because when I was arrested and I was put in the back of the squad car, a lot of people think that that's when the fear flies, but it's not. It's before that, because until you're back in the squad car and you're not getting beat up, you never know if you're going to run into that one individual. So that's kind of the scary part. Once you get into all that stuff, that's where it's kind of like, okay, well, what's the process? Each kind of thing is, each person is different, but I don't mind it too much. I get nervous before that, because I don't know what's going to happen or how much harm could be caused to me during that spot. So I try to always let people know, hey, I'm not going to resist. I'm not going to run. That's not, I have no ill will towards you guys. I don't want to cause any harm, those kind of things. I try to do those things. So,
Thank you for calling in, Kali Kaku, and you feel free to call back anytime.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So there's Dara asked a question. I don't know if you want to take that one.
Dara, thank you for the $5. a question relating to the sovereign citizen movement. Is there actually a way to legally not pay taxes as a sovereign citizen in this country? No, there's not. And I mean, if you're on an Indian reservation, or if you're part of, some exclusive group of people who are recognized as sovereign, but you don't just get to declare yourself a sovereign citizen and then exclude yourself from paying taxes, because that's just not how it works. I'm sure that is often a tactic of sovereign citizens where they, back up the taxes, or they introduce frivolous cases into the court and they overload court systems. There have been many organized movements in the past by sovereign citizens to make that happen. And there's simply no way to declare yourself as sovereign. If like I said, though, you could exist as a group of people who are sovereign, such as Indian reservations and just Native Americans in general, have a certain degree of sovereignty, even if they exist within, as a citizen of the United States. They are afforded certain leniencies, so to speak, that they can take advantage of as Native Americans. So there's certainly...
Yeah, and I don't remember, there's a book on this. So here's a problem with sovereign citizens too that really bugs me, is they take little bits of information and they completely twist it to their own ideology. And so it's not helpful at all. But there is a book that is out there, and I'm very not knowledgeable. I have a buddy who's super knowledgeable about it. There is a book that talks about taxes and citizens and whether or not they have to pay taxes. There is some argument, and there are people who've actually gotten rid of their social security number, and they've gotten rid of W-2s and things like that. How it works, I don't know. I'm not qualified enough to speak on it, but there is a book out there that talks about how the definitions of tax law and code are different than the way that it's interpreted. And there is some speculation from some individuals that say that essentially you either have to be an employee of the state or government, or you have to be an immigrant to pay taxes. I don't know if that's actually fair, true, not, but I will say this: there are different groups besides just sovereign citizens that believe that.
Right.
So everything you hear on this kind of stuff, whether it comes with case law, whether it comes with tax law, all those things you got to do your own research on, because there's a lot of people that tell you a lot of different stuff, and you could try and implement it and find yourself in a world of hurt. I would go to a professional and have a conversation with them about it.
Yeah, and even in that respect, there's probably not a whole lot of professionals out there that are going to tell you different or take the time to really look into whether or not you can avoid paying taxes. But I would also say that taxes are a relatively necessary thing. And I, as an American citizen, don't have a problem with taxes. What I have a problem with is the misuse of those taxes and the fact that they go to all of these things that don't benefit me directly. And it's strange to me to think that we live in such a thriving capitalist society that doesn't pay back the citizen for what they put in. That's the very foundation of capitalism, is getting what you put in, getting that back, and even more. And that never seems to happen with tax money. And Congress and all of our governing bodies, it's almost as if we don't have a say in how that works and how that goes.
Well, we really don't. And I think that that's by design. And again, this is why I don't get into the political party stuff, on my program or on your program or any program, just because it's a lot of times I think we haven't earned the right to have that argument yet, to be quite honest with you, in my opinion. And the reason I say that way is because, we can't even focus on the basics of the foundation of our country right now. And I think that was designed by politicians, both sides. I don't think there's any one side or another that's different. So what we, the people, do, and moving forward, is going to be what makes the changes or doesn't and allows them to stay. And so doing the stuff that we're doing in the kind of movements that we're involved in, I think will help bring people back to, okay, what is the fundamental part of this country? And the first thing is our constitutional rights, because those allow us to do everything from have a say in elections to what kind of shop or store we want to open up, and laws follow in right behind that, and the enforcement of those laws. Right. So if we can focus on the stuff that affects our day-to-day life, then we can start to earn the right to have the problems or conversations about what do we do geopolitically, what do we do, economically, in terms of funding different things, and those we can start to get into that. But taxes, I think that's one of the reasons why they like the argument, because they tax the crap out of us. Then they spend the money on whatever they want to, and then they create an argument over that. And so now you have both sides arguing. And really what we should be doing is saying, don't tax the crap out of us. How about hold yourself responsible and and pay for the things that we, the people, elected you to pay for.
Yeah.
And they've forgotten that we're here, that they work for us. We're their constituents.
And
that's the problem.
Well, I think a lot of that is the psychology of being a freaking representative, and being a congressman or whatever position you hold in government. That same power mentality that exists with officers also exists there, and the dehumanization of people happens there as well. So it kind of goes back to that whole power structure and how that affects people. We have another caller here, so I'm going to throw them in. Hey, caller, you're on the radio show. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. It was about a traffic stop.
Okay.
Or about traffic stops. My question was, whenever an officer pulls you over for, let's just say, a tail light that was out, or any other, reasonable thing like that, just to see if, you can fix it or whatnot. And when they pull you over and then they ask you, may they search your vehicle or whatnot, and if you say no, they call a canine instead. Is that considered legal?
No. And first of all, this was recently decided. I believe that the case was in 2017. It was Rodriguez versus United States. And it basically said, the conclusion was that you cannot prolong a routine traffic stop for any reason. And a lot of officers tend to prolong traffic stops to get canine units out there. And that was what the whole Rodriguez case centered around, was an officer extending the length of a traffic stop in order to bring about a canine unit to the scene, which ultimately resulted in a search that yielded contraband that was eventually thrown out. And the problem, though, with the Rodriguez case and with every situation like this is that there is no standardized time limit for a traffic stop. So an officer could easily say, well, I radioed in the canine unit and I started writing the citation. They got there before I finished, and here we are. And that would likely fall under the protections. But also, if you're sitting on the side of the road for 45 minutes waiting for a canine unit to come, then the Rodriguez ruling probably would come into play. So this is one of those situations where there's no straight line rules for this, and there's no real parameters and specifics that have been set up. And it's one of those cases where a court would have to take into consideration the totality of the circumstances and look at each stop on a case-by-case basis to determine whether or not the traffic stop was, prolonged in order to bring out a canine unit. Did you want to add anything to that, John?
Yeah. Yes. So I wrote down a couple of things just to kind of touch on with that. So two things. This is going to be left up to the interpretation based off of the facts and findings regarding, let's just say it's your traffic stop. But the way that I would look at things is, it's okay if by me implementing my rights, things take longer. Because two things can happen. Number one, I may be able to completely get everything void, or maybe I'm not even breaking the law at all. But I may be able to use this Rodriguez versus US. The other thing too is that a lot of times officers will say something to you and may not mean it. They may say they're going to get your name. I've had plenty of situations where an officer has said, in fact, AtA covered one of them, but an officer says, I'm right, you're wrong. And as soon as my sergeant gets here, he's going to tell you the same thing, or she's going to tell you the same thing. And a lot of times that doesn't happen. So it's okay to challenge those things. Let those things take a lot longer. And if somebody says to me, hey, if you're not gonna let me search your vehicle, you obviously have something to hide. I'm gonna bring a canine out here. I'd say, awesome, go ahead and do that. And while you're at it, please make sure you send a sergeant out or a supervisor of any sort to come out to the scene. And that's
Is
my
that considered
response.
suspicious?
They can call it whatever they want. It doesn't matter. This is the problem: is people start to worry about, is my rights going to be considered suspicious if I implement them on the side of the road or on a sidewalk or whatever. During any police interaction, your response should always be to implement your rights. I have lots of friends that are cops. I've done ride-alongs. I've trained law enforcement. Now my stuff is more towards like special operations and close quarters combat kind of stuff. But even during those ride-alongs, the light that you're talking about, a lot of times, I'll give you an example. There was a guy that I was doing a ride-along. I won't mention the county. There was a guy who had a license plate light that was out. Couldn't see his license plate unless your lights were hitting it. And I said, are we going to pull that vehicle over? And the guy says, no, we're not, because it's a little bit early. We're going to give that some time. We may need that later. If the guy fixes it, but then is drunk, we won't have a reason to pull him over. So understand, and that guy I'm talking about is not a bad guy. He's just using logic. And that's what everybody else is failing to do, is they're not using logic on their side and looking at all aspects. There is a play. If it's 1 a.m, you get pulled over for a taillight, you bet your ass they are trying to figure out something else. They want to smell your breath. They want to see if they can see contraband in the vehicle that would give them probable cause. They want to see if they could sniff, scent of something, and then ask you if they can search the vehicle. Sometimes they'll just ask you if they can search the vehicle just because to see what you say, and so many people say yes. So there's so many aspects to that. It doesn't matter if it's suspicious. A lot of people have fallen for the trap of, well, if you have nothing to hide, let me look through your vehicle. Okay, well, that's like me going to my neighbor's house and saying, can I come in? I just want to look around. If you have nothing to hide, I should be able to look around your house. That's weird. Don't allow that. And I would turn that back on them. But also remember that arguing is going to add time. So don't engage too much. Stand for your rights and say, look, I'm not going to consent for you to search my vehicle unless you have probable cause. I don't think you have at this point in time. I'm going to go ahead and just implement my rights. And I also would like to speak to a supervisor. I'd like your name, badge number, and business card if you can provide that to me. And have the camera on. Turn the radio off, put the camera on, and roll with it.
Don't officers, like, it's a policy, it's not an actual law that they have to give you their badge number and stuff? Can't they, like, deny giving you that?
So that's a great question. And the two things that I think are really important is, number one, to know, wherever you spend the most time driving or possible interactions with law enforcement, I would understand and know their state codes and their local ordinances. But a lot of times, like the state of Minnesota anyways, there's been a requirement, at least for state patrol, that if they're doing a traffic stop, that they have to present some form of identification to you, generally speaking, the name of a badge number or name. But then also, the great thing is they all have policies that you can request, do a data practice request and say, I'd like to see your department's policies.
Yeah.
And then hold them accountable for it.
You're right that most of the time, and it is just a policy violation. And the problem that comes with that is that even if you were to request that policy, you can prove that the officer didn't identify himself when requested. It's up to the department whether or not they actually want to do something about that. And there's no laws that force departments to reprimand officers for violating policies. So there's a good chance that even if you do go through all these steps and you prove for a fact that the officer didn't identify themselves upon request, that nothing's going to happen. And, even if something does happen, you will never know what it was. And they most of the time they don't have to tell you what form of reprimand they actually did. So,
and this is where reform, I think, is super important too, right? Because two things: we as a society do not have the real numbers about how many complaints are made versus how many of those are actually taken seriously. Where do they go? What happens to the officer? How do we know that that's been a consistent problem if they're hiding this stuff? So in order to start to get consistent numbers and then talk about real reform with an actual aspect that allows us to see where problems have arisen, I would say the first thing is to file the complaint, do the data practice request, or if it's a federal level FOIA request, and then file a written complaint and then document that information and do more FOIA requests, or data practice requests on that officer to see if they've had previous complaints. I've done a video just to show how to do it and what it looks like, what it feels like.
But can't that be risky? Like, say if you're complaining about an officer and you live in the county where you were pulled over and you just so happen to magically get pulled over a lot more frequently.
Yeah. So again, this is where recording stuff is going to be really important, but also, filing that complaint is going to be important, but retain a copy of that. Maybe you want to make sure it's certified mail so that you know that it's sent in. The other thing is you don't have to write your name on most of these, and do your research to see if you are indeed required to write a name to file a complaint. Most departments that's a policy thing. That is not a law thing. And the only thing that's law related is if you file a false police report. So if you file a complaint and you want to file that and you want to put an email that you specifically have set up for complaints, that doesn't list your name or something, go ahead and do that and then file that, and don't put your name or address, don't give an ID, and just do those things.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
thank you very much.
Don't be afraid of retaliation when it comes for just filing requests or complaints on officers. I mean, there's a good chance that they're not going to take that seriously anyway. And even if they do, and you do start getting harassed, then you're building a lawsuit. So, and that's not how this whole process is supposed to work anyway, where officers are supposed to be informed of who filed a complaint and what they, what they said and all that. That's not they
deal with too many people at a time anyways.
Yeah. And the only thing that I would caution you is that rural departments probably operate on a lot different, structures than a more organized and accountable metropolitan department. So just be aware that there probably is some inherent risk associated with that if you are, in a small town, because everyone knows each other and whatnot.
Yeah, and I would also say lastly that there's one other option I think a lot of people don't discuss, but it is an option to kind of investigate a little bit more, which is, at least in Minnesota, we have the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. A lot of times if there's a law enforcement involved shooting, the BCA comes in and takes a look at it. And so they're the ones that'll conduct a officer involved shooting. But I wouldn't hesitate, depending on the scenario or the level, is it an egregious kind of complaint? Well, I might go straight to the BCA and ask them to investigate that department, or ask them if they know of a different organization that's more statewide that could look into that department because of corruption or concerns or safety issues or whatever it may be. And then make sure, again, you document that, like ATA said, you can also have the ability to file a lawsuit if those kind of things happen. And maybe you're saying, well, I don't want to pay more in taxes because I sued my own county. Well, you don't always have to sue for a dollar amount. You can sue for policy change, and then go from there. So remember that as well.
And the FBI is another.
Yep, that's another one.
Is another resource that you could potentially reach out to if you are ever a victim of police misconduct. So this is another thing to consider.
Yeah, that's a good question.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you guys for your time, and thank you for everything that you do.
Absolutely. Thanks for calling in. All right. Well, I think we'll wrap that up there. And, we've been going for about 2 hours now. And, I hope that this podcast radio show was beneficial to everyone. And, be sure to go and check out Rowdy. He has a YouTube channel. He has a podcast. He's working on a bunch of interesting projects. And I think that you guys will definitely be interested in that. And once again, tomorrow there will be a brand new episode of ATA. The YouTube algorithm has been giving us a stiff one lately. So if you could just check it out, let me know what you think, leave a comment, whatnot. I'd appreciate your participation.
They should just do what I do, because I hit the notification bell for
for
the channel for ATA. So because
that would help.
That's the best way to do it. Plus, I know your schedule for the most part.
Yeah,
keep track of it.
I try to put out content every Monday. Sometimes I throw in an extra video some point during the week. I'm hoping to do that this week, and then we'll try to keep that consistent schedule. It's been a little difficult lately, but it's getting better. So anyway, thank you all for joining us. I'll see you guys probably next week on the radio show. And once again, check out Rowdy's